so on and so forth. Many times you can just say, well, just go get your own address. I don't care what it is, right? Because otherwise you have to keep this long list of IP addresses assigned to each individual device, and make sure that when you purchase a new device, when you assign a new IP address, you don't reuse the same address. Because having two appliances on the same subnet that have an identical IP address is not good. It's kind of like having two phones having the same phone number, okay, within the same area code. Not a good thing. Okay? So you don't want to go through the manual trouble to make sure that this happens, and a lot of times you can just ask the appliance and say, well, go get your own IP address, and whatever mechanism is granting or assigning these IP addresses, just make sure that you don't reassign the same IP address to different appliances. And that mechanism is called DHCP, or the protocol is called DHCP, or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Okay, I don't really bother to write down the long name of these abbreviations, because you can look it up from Wikipedia and many other resources online. Okay, it is also known as dynamic IP addresses, because it's assigning IP addresses, dynamically instead of statically. This is also available on most routers, so that by default, these computers by default would use DHCP because they don't need to have a specific IP address attached to it. Okay, most routers can also say that, okay, if you want to reserve a range of IP addresses that are statically assigned with the IP addresses, you can do that too. So you can have a mixture. You can have half of the appliances automatically getting the IP address, and the other half have a static IP attached to them. Like with security cameras, you probably want to have static IP within your house. So that way when you go to 196.168.0.200, you will be accessing the garage security camera. 201 would go to the backyard, 202 would go to the side yard, and so on and so forth. Okay? Are you guys getting the basic idea okay? Okay. And then there are other things that are also completely optional. There's the DNS server. Okay. The DNS server is basically 411 in terms of computer networking. Do you guys remember when I talked about how it is not really reasonable to ask people to remember the IP addresses of servers? Instead of accessing eBay.com, can you tell me what is the IP address corresponding to eBay.com? Probably not. Okay? So that means when you type eBay.com in the URL, it's going through what we call a DNS server, or DNS stands for name service. Okay, what is the D? I don't think it's dynamic. Domain, that's it. A DNS stands for domain name service. Okay? So a DNS server is a server that will basically serve the function of 411. Okay? When you type eBay.com and press the enter key on the URL of your web browser, your computer behind your back will basically query and ask a DNS server and say, oh, my user asked me to go to eBay.com, but I don't know where it is. Okay, I know the name, but I don't know the IP address. The DNS server will come back and say, oh, okay, let me look it up. All right, eBay.com, okay, I think it has an IP address of blah, 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 blah. So the DNS server will come back with a reply and say, okay, the IP address, try this. At that point, your computer running the browser would actually access the eBay.com server by its IP address. Okay, because the only way you can access a computer on the network is by the IP address. When you type in the URL using the domain name, like ebay.com, someprof.org, or whatever, that always has to translate into the IP address before your computer can access the other computer. So the DNS server is very important, because without the DNS server, then you have to know the exact IP address of each and every website that you visit, which is a big hassle. Not impossible, it's just a big hassle to have to do that. Okay? So sometimes when you quote unquote lose network connectivity at home, you can try to access certain websites by their IP addresses. If your computers can still access by IP address but not by the domain name, it means the configuration of the DNS server is wrong, okay, or the DNS server has gone down. But your internet connection is still up because you can still access the other computers by the IP address. On the other hand, if you try to access by IP address and that is not working, then you know either the network is down entirely or your gateway is down. Because if your gateway is down, then you cannot access to the outside world. But in that case, if you cannot go out to the internet, the next step is to see if you can reach other computers within the same subnet. Okay, because within the same subnet, you don't need a gateway at all. Your router can be unplugged entirely. Well, I shouldn't say that. Your router may not be able to go outside, but it can still connect computers within the same subnet. If you cannot connect to other computers within the same subnet, then your router probably has gone, cuckoo, or is broken, or there's a physical wire connection. At that point, it becomes harder to diagnose the problem because you need to actually physically check the connections, check the router box. You can try to power down and power up the router again. Sometimes that will fix problems. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I was reading an article in the book. Some countries destroy the DNS system so their citizens don't get access to free speech.
Well, countries like China, they have very tight control over the internet, which is partially why Google got into hot water with the Chinese government. How many people kind of know something about that? Okay. So basically, China, as a country, as a government, wanted to make sure that its citizens do not have access to certain information on the internet. Okay, about certain incidents that happen in China, about certain truths, or certain facts, that are outside of China. But how do you limit the access of information? I mean, it is almost inconceivable, by our standards. But how can you do that? Well, the first thing they can do is to limit, what search engines can and cannot, show up as results. Okay, because most people don't know the IP address of a computer that has a story on the Tiananmen, incident. Okay, which is one of the things, that the government do not want people to access. But since most people do not know the IP address, they will rely on a search engine to look for articles written about that particular incident. In other words, I can do this. I can just go to Google here, and I can type, Tien, T-I-E-N, on, close enough. Okay, incident. Okay. Okay, so, and Google is good enough to recognize what I really want to access, did all the spell check for me, and locate a Wikipedia entry for that particular thing. Okay, so if the search engine is doctored or restricted so that certain search keywords cannot have any results, that limits, like 85% or 90% of the population will no longer be able to access articles like this on their own because they do not have access to a search engine on that specific topic anymore. Okay, so that was one of the agreements that Google had to agree to when they, opened up business in China, was basically to allow the Chinese government to specify what websites or what articles or what search keywords should not return any results. Okay, and this has nothing to do with porn, has nothing to do with ethnic moral issues. It only has to do with what the government wants to control, in terms of what type of information the citizens should have access to. Okay, and this is not done by IP addresses at all. This is all done by the search engine. Okay. Are there any questions? Yep.
What happens if you type the IP address of another computer in your home network into the browser?
That's a good question. If you're located in China, and if you already know the exact IP address of a server...
I mean, just within your own home network, what happens if you type the IP address of another computer that you own?
That you own?
Into the browser.
Then you access the computer as, using its web server interface. Okay? Which is actually quite interesting because once you assign an IP address to a printer that is networked, and you try to use your web browser to go to that address, guess what? You will see a page. Your printer, it has a miniature web server so that you can configure the printer using a web type interface. Same thing for your security camera. Same thing for your television. Same thing for your toaster that will go onto the internet in the next 5 years. Okay? Well, trust me, there are reasons why why you might want to put your toaster onto your network. Also, your rice cooker, your oven. The stove may be a little bit dangerous to put onto the network, but your temperature control, climate control at home, I can see reasons why you might want to network it and have a web interface. Okay, have you guys seen those newer, more complicated electronic thermostats from like Home Depot and whatnot? They try to put in a lot of features, right? They try to put in features like you can have on a daily basis. Each day can be different from the previous day. You can set the temperature to be this much, when you're home, and this much to be when you're away, and so on and so forth. But there's only so much you can do with like 10 keys, or even with a touch screen, because the touch screen is only this big. What about changing that thing to become a web-based interface? Then suddenly you have no limitations whatsoever. Because with a web interface, you are accessing it through a typical computer that has a large screen. So now suddenly, in terms of what you can do with your thermostat, from only having 10 keys and a display only about this big that can only display 2 lines at the same time, you now have a web experience. Okay? So I personally think that it makes sense to put thermostats onto the network so that you can use a web browser to access your thermostat at home. What if you're going to work late? Okay, let's imagine someone is single. Okay, is going to work late, and so there's no need to turn on the furnace anytime before say 10 p.m. Okay. Well, using an existing thermostat, you can't do it. Okay, once it is programmed to turn itself on at 6 o'clock p.m., it's going to turn on at 6 p.m. There's no way to override it unless you're at the thermostat to override it. But once it goes onto the network, if you have the ability to go from your work office computer back to your home network, guess what? Now you can reconfigure everything that is attached to the network. You can make the rice cooker to start later. You can make your oven to start later, and you can also make your thermostat to override it and say, don't turn it on until 10 p.m. Okay? So there are all these things that you can do once things are connected. How about security? It would be nice if you can just log into your home computer or your home network and be able to see, has the UPS guy dropped off a package yet? Okay? You can do it if you have all this networking stuff, and you can do it now. This technology is already here. Okay, it's just that the number of devices that we have attached to a home network is still going to see a sharp increase in the next 5 years or so as electronics gets cheaper and cheaper. Yep.
What about like what you were saying with security, but security for the network for those individual items? So
they will probably rely on the router to stop most of the attacks. Once someone gets past the router or the firewall, most of these smaller devices either have an obscure operating system that cannot really be easily hacked because nobody knows about these little smaller operating systems, or they would have their own protection against intrusion. So for the most part, you have to rely on the firewall at least right now. But once somebody gets past the firewall, the computers inside the local area network, or at least those appliances will be fairly, they're open to attacks for the most part. Because they want to burn your toast.
They can turn on all of your appliances and waste all your electricity, causing your electric bill to go up.
Or they can turn off, your security cameras and also your outside lights before they, come and try to steal your stuff.
yeah.
Yep.